Welcome back to Lullaby Atlas. Tonight we travel through the myths of ancient Greece. Close your eyes, let the world fall away. Deep in the world, farther than any road leads, there's a hollow mountain where the sun has never once touched the stone. No dawn light creeps beneath the rock, no noon brightens the air above it, no evening turns the walls gold. The light simply does not come here. Instead, a cool fog rises slowly from the ground, pale as breath on a winter morning, carrying the faint green scent of herbs that grow without ever needing the sun. Herbs whose crushed leaves gather drowsiness the way other plants gather dew. At the base of the rock, a river moves, Lethe, the river of forgetting, and it speaks the only sound the place allows, a low, even murmur of water sliding over pale pebbles, smooth as worn glass, arranged by some patience older than memory. The sound does not rise and fall. It simply continues, the way certain things continue. The turning of the stars, the slow weight of deep soil pressing down. To stand here and listen is to feel the day's sharp edges gently, quietly round themselves into nothing. At the cave's mouth, poppies grow in abundance. Dark red, blood dark, their heavy heads nodding very slightly on their long, pale stems, as though each one is already half asleep. There is no wind to move them. They nod by their own quiet heaviness alone. Their scent is faint, bittersweet, cool, the kind of scent that does not demand attention but simply settles over everything gradually, the way evening settles, until at some unmarked moment one realizes it has been there all along. There is no door to this cave. A door might creak. The silence here is of such quality and such age that even the possibility of a creak, even the ghost of a hinge sound imagined from far off, would be a kind of violence. So the cave simply opens, without ceremony, dark giving way to darker, mist giving way to the cool interior air that smells of stone and poppy, and a deep, mineral stillness found nowhere else in the world. A stillness that enters the chest and slows the breath almost before one is aware of it. Inside, on a couch of black ebony, lies Hypnos, the god of sleep. He lies with his limbs loose and perfectly slack, the way no waking creature ever quite manages. Each muscle fully surrendered, each joint easy, the whole body resting the way a stone rests at the bottom of still water. He is young-faced and quietly beautiful, with small wings at his temples, pale as moth wings folded still. In his hand, loosely, a stem of poppy. His breath is even. It has always been even. It will always be even. All around him, the dreams drift. They are the onoroi. That is what the old poets called them. The dreams, formless and many, more numerous than the poets could name, as many as the ears of barley in a field at harvest, as many as leaves shaking at the height of summer, as many as grains of sand along a long, dark shore at the edge of an indifferent sea. They drift without urgency, without sound. Some are pale, some are dark. All are waiting with the patience of things that have nowhere else to be. The sweetest of all gods, that is what the story calls him. Not the most powerful, not the most feared, but the sweetest, because he comes to everyone without exception, king and shepherd alike, and he quiets even the most restless, even those whose minds will not be still at the end of the day, even those who carry their worries the way a traveler carries a heavy pack, long after they might have set it down. Even these, eventually, Hypnos reaches with his gentle hand, and the worries soften and the eyes close. His twin brother is Thanatos, gentle death. Where Thanatos has, the old poet said, a heart of iron, for he must be impartial, and impartiality at such a scale requires a steadiness that feels like iron. Hypnos has only kindness. The two of them rest together at the edge of the world, twin sons of night, and they are not frightening, or they ought not to be. Sleep and death, the two long rests, the two doors through which everything living must eventually pass, one each night and one at the last. At the threshold of this hall at the world's edge, night and day cross paths, the story goes. One goes out as the other comes in, and the house never holds them both at once. They meet at the doorstep, just a moment of meeting, a breath, and between them they carry everything: the bright-edged day, with all its waking noise, and the deep night with its softer sounds, the owl, the settling house, the murmur of Lethe's water, the gentle, heavy dark that presses down like a kind hand on a tired shoulder. Nyx, night. She is older than almost everything, older than the gods of Olympus, older than the sea in its current form, one of the first things to exist when existence itself was new and strange and very quiet. Before the mountains had their shape, before the rivers found their beds, before the first bird opened its wings over the first morning, there was night, drawing her dark cloth across the sky, gathering her children to her, moving slowly and without hurry, because hurry has never been any part of her. Her mantle is sewn with stars. That is how the old images show her, and it is as accurate a description as any. Each evening she rises from her halls in the far west, where the last red has just faded from the sea, and she unfolds the dark. She draws it eastward, slowly, steadily, the way one draws a cloth over a sleeping child. And folded in that darkness come her gentlest children, sleep and dreams and soft-handed rest, riding with her across the sky and settling one by one on the rooftops and the fields and the slow rivers below. Even Zeus, the greatest of the Olympian gods, is careful not to displease Nyx. That's what the story says. Not in fear exactly, but in the same deep, instinctive reverence with which even the most powerful of things will make a wide and respectful orbit around something older and stranger and more fundamental than itself. Night is older than the gods. Night was there before them, and it will close over everything after. This is not a frightening thing. It is simply the way of it, and there is a great comfort in something so vast and so old and so reliable. There was a night, the story tells, and it is the kind of story that has the quality of a very old dream, soft at the edges, certain at the center, when Hypnos lay his gift over all the world at once, over the earth and the sea, over the watching sky, over the fields and the mountains and the long dark roads, over the halls of kings and the palates of the poor, over the shepherds in the hills and the sailors on the water. Everything slept. The only things awake were the stars, burning quietly in the vast dark, performing their slow business with no audience at all. Chief among Hypnos's children is Morpheus, a name the old Greeks gave to the most skilled of the dreams, the one who can take any human shape, wear any human face, speak in any human voice, and walk so convincingly through a sleeper's mind that the dreamer believes without question. Morpheus is the dream of the person, the beloved face appearing at the bedside, the friend's voice speaking just the right words. When one wakes from such a dream and reaches toward it and finds only air, that reaching and that absence is also Morpheus, patient and faithful, doing his gentle work. At the far edge of the cave, deeper than the lampless dark, deeper than the poppies and the river and the drifting pale shapes of the formless dreams, there are two gates. Through one, which is made of polished horn, smooth and faintly translucent, the true dreams pass, the ones that show things as they are or will be, the ones that leave behind a clarity that clings like dew through the first hour of morning. Through the other gate, made of ivory, carved and elaborate and beautiful, pass the sweet, false dreams, the gentle illusions, the dreams that give comfort without quite touching truth. Both gates are good. The old poets who noticed these things did not call the ivory gate a lesser gift. A dream that comforts without being true is still a dream that comforts, and comfort on a long night has its own worth. When the wind blows cold, and the dark is very long, and the body is tired, and the mind has not yet found its way to stillness, on such a night, a sweet and gentle dream, whatever its nature, is a thing to be grateful for. A small lamp in a long corridor, enough to make the walking possible. The river Lethe continues its low murmur over the pebbles. Its sound does not change. It has the quality of something that could be listened to for a very long time without fatigue, not because it is interesting, but because it is complete, and completeness requires nothing from the listener. The water is cold and very clear, though in the dimness the pebbles at the bottom look dark. The river does not rush, it slides. There is a difference. Rushing implies urgency. Sliding implies the simple following of the ground's own slow inclination. Down, always gently down. The cave is not cold in an unpleasant way. It is cool the way deep stone is always cool, the temperature of things that have never been warmed by any sun, and so have come to a steady, reliable, entirely neutral temperature of their own. It is the temperature at which the body, gradually, finds that there is no particular difference between itself and the air around it, and this discovery, the soft loss of that boundary, is one of the oldest invitations to sleep. The body forgets where it ends. The air forgets where it begins. For a long while, then, there is only the river. Everything that follows, drifting up through the next hours of the dark, the stories of the gods and the seasons, the sea and the mountain and the bright meadow, rises from this place. It rises the way that mist rises from the ground here, slowly, without plan, curling up through the still air and taking shapes that are almost recognizable before dissolving back into pale. They are the dreams of Hypnos's cave, offered freely, without demand, to anyone who lies down and is willing to let go of the day, to let the water of Lethe slide past, carrying away the day's long weight. Hypnos does not move. He has never needed to move much. The dreams go out on his behalf, and the river does the other work, and the poppies do the rest. He lies on his couch of black ebony, in the air that smells of cool stone and night herbs and the faint bitterness of the Lethe's edge, and he is, in this moment and every moment, exactly where he is supposed to be. There is no other place. There is no other time. There is only the cave and the river's low voice and the dark above the poppies and the slow, patient settling of the world into its nightly rest. And so the night begins, not with a fanfare, not with light, but with the absence of light, which is the more honest beginning. Nyx draws her star-sewn mantle slowly across the sky above. Lethe slides over its pebbles below. Hypnos breathes, even and slow, on his couch of black down, and the formless dreams stir around him, choosing shapes, moving toward the gate of horn, or the gate of ivory, drifting out into the wide and sleeping world. Let the first of them come now. Let it rise and take a shape and tell its old, old story, soft as wool, slow as deep water, warm as a lamp held close. We follow a dream back to the very beginning of things, before the first hill rose, before the first shore caught the first wave. There was, the old poet said, a vast and yawning gap. Not quite darkness, not quite silence, but something older than either. A wide and formless opening in which nothing yet had a name or a weight or a color. Chaos, they called it. And it was not frightening, only enormous, the way the moment before a breath is enormous, the way the space between two heartbeats holds a kind of quiet that words cannot reach. And then, gently, the way a sleeper turns and settles deeper into warmth, came Gaia. Broad-breasted Gaia, the earth, the ever-sure foundation of all things. She arrived not with a sound, but with a weight, a steadiness, the feeling of ground under bare feet after a long walk through water. She was, the poet sang, the beginning of firmness itself, the first thing that could be touched and trusted, the first thing that did not shift or dissolve. Below her, in the deep places where no light would reach, lay dim Tartaros, still and very far below. And there was Eros, not yet the winged youth of later stories, but something older and more elemental, the force that draws one thing toward another, the inclination of water downhill, the lean of a vine toward the light. Hesiod named him among the very first, because without him nothing would have sought anything else, and the world would have remained a collection of separate, beautiful, untouching things. He was the warmth behind all warmth, the reason the earth did not lie still and cold in her dark room, but opened and breathed and began. From the great gap came Erebos, a deep and velvety darkness that pooled in low places and gathered under overhanging rock, and with him came Night, Nyx herself, the very same whose son Hypnos sleeps even now in his cavern, whose mantle is the sky between one star and the next. Night moved over the new world the way a mother draws a shawl around a child's shoulders, quiet and encompassing, and where she passed, she left a hush. And from Night and Erebos together, in the old poet's telling, came bright ether, the high, pure upper air, and day, like a lamp being carried into a room. Then Gaia brought forth the starry sky to cover her on every side, to be a home, a canopy, a counterpart. Sky settled over earth the way a lid settles over a bowl, the way clouds settle into a valley at evening, neither grasping nor departing, but simply resting, present, framing all that lay between. And from the space between earth and sky, everything else would in time become possible. Gaia also brought forth the hills, whose long ridges rose slowly like the backs of sleeping animals, and the sea, which gathered in the low places and began at once its old habit of murmuring and shifting and going nowhere in particular. Gaia and the sky had many children, the Titans, great and old, the elder powers of the world, each one a force of nature wearing a face. There was a time, the old stories acknowledge, when Sky and his children did not always agree, and in time the younger powers came into their own, and the world settled into the shape it would keep. The old poets did not dwell long on that turning. They moved past it as one moves past a closed door in a house full of lamplight, knowing the rest of the rooms are warm and the night outside is held at bay, and the telling is already moving forward towards something gentler. And from the bright sea foam, the poets sang, from the pale foam where the sea's own oldest power had passed into the water, rose Aphrodite. She stood on a shell, the shell curving white beneath her feet like cupped hands, and the soft west wind, Zephyros, breathed her gently toward shore. The sea was calm that day, flecked with light, and the waves that carried her were long and low and easy, the kind that come in the late afternoon when the wind has found its mood and settled into it. She stepped ashore on a shore that smelled of salt and warmed stone, and where her feet touched the ground, the poet said, flowers opened. She moved through the world slowly, this new thing, love in a visible form, and the world tilted toward her the way sunflowers tilt at noon. Doves gathered on warm rooftops. The myrtle bloomed on dry hillsides where nothing much had bloomed before. The sea, which had been merely beautiful, became beautiful in a different way. The kind of beautiful that makes the watcher want to say something, though the words do not arrive. Aphrodite walked the shore and the meadows and the high rock faces where wild roses grew in thin soil, and wherever she walked the air had a quality of arrival, of something expected finally appearing. Now the old poets speak of the Golden Age, the first age of people, and here the voice softens almost to a murmur. Hesiod calls them the Golden Race, and says they lived like gods, with quiet hearts, far from toil and grief. The earth gave its fruit without asking, the grain rose from untilled soil, the orchards bore without pruning, the pastures were deep and sweet, and the flocks wandered home at evening without being driven. There was no shipbuilding, no quarrying of stone, no need for walls. The world was so arranged that it simply provided, the way a good house provides warmth, without being thanked for it. They feasted, the old stories say, on good things, and they rested well, and the seasons were mild and unhurried. There was no sickness as we know it, no long wearing down. When death came at last to one of the golden people, it came as sleep comes, a gradual deepening, a slowing of the breath, the weight of the body growing pleasant and heavy, until the eyes closed with the same ease with which they had opened each morning throughout a long life. They became, the poet said, kindly spirits drifting unseen over the earth, watchers of mortal men, givers of quiet luck. Not lost, only changed, moving softly from one form of being into another. There is something restful in imagining that first world, in following it with the mind's slow eye through its long, unhurried afternoons. The meadows uncut, the air warm and faintly scented with wild thyme and the blossom of stone fruit trees, the sound of bees in the clover enormous and filling, the only sound for miles in any direction. No hammer, no cartwheel, no voice raised in argument. Only the bees and the wind in the long grass, and somewhere a stream going about its business of arriving at the sea, taking its time, pausing in the shade of the alders to consider its direction before continuing on. But time moved, as it always does, even in the oldest stories, and the world began to take on new arrangements. The Sky Father Kronos ruled in the age that followed, and the stories say it was still a good age in its way, a reign of order, of deep soil and heavy harvests, of the year turning on its proper axis. A time of golden fruit stored in stone jars, of oil pressed in the last warmth of autumn, of the kind of plenty that makes people quiet and satisfied, leaning against warm walls, listening to the evening birds, not wanting very much beyond what they already have. That is a good kind of life, the old stories agree, unhurried and sufficient. When the youngest of the great children was born, Zeus, who would in time become the keeper of the sky and the holder of the bright lightning, his mother hid him away on the island of Crete, so that he might grow in safety, sheltered from the turning of great powers above. She carried him through the night, the old poets say, to a cave on the slopes of Mount Ida, where the air smelled of pine resin and deep stone and the cold green breath of the mountain. And she laid him in the dark quiet of that cave and left him in good hands, with good guardians, and with the mountain itself for a roof. The goat Amalthea came to him there, a white goat, the old stories say, with curved amber horns, who climbed the steep path to the cave without difficulty and folded her legs and let the child drink her warm milk. And the wild bees of Mount Ida, which have always been known for their excellent honey, darker and more fragrant than the honey of the plains, carrying the taste of mountain thyme and rock rose and the thin air itself, the wild bees came too, navigating by their own knowledge through the shadow of the cave, and left their honey for him where the stone made a natural bowl. The bees of Mount Ida are remembered with particular tenderness in the old stories, their honey honored as among the finest things the island produces, dark gold, thick, with a warmth that settles in the chest like something remembered rather than something new. It was said that in later ages, when the people of Crete wished to give thanks at the end of the day, they set out a small clay dish of honey at the threshold of the house, an offering left where the last light fell, so that the bees might know their work was known and valued. The lamp was brought in, the dish was left, the evening was allowed to continue in its quiet way. And outside the cave, the young Corettes danced. They were the guardians, young men, the stories say, bronze-armed and light-footed, and they moved in a circle around the cave's entrance on the dark mountain nights, clashing their shields together and stamping their feet on the stone, making a cheerful rhythmic noise, a regular and reassuring clamor. The sound of bronze on bronze, the stamping of feet, the shout of young voices, rising and falling and rising again in time. It was not frightening, not harsh, but steady, like a drum beaten beside a cradle, like a song that has no words but holds the shape of comfort nonetheless. So the infant slept through the clashing and the stamping, held in the warmth of the cave, smelling the honey and the milk and the cold stone and the far-off pine, while outside the mountain night turned above, star by slow star, and Nyx drew her mantle of dark sky across Crete, as she did across all islands, all shores, all the sleeping world. Inside, the child's breath was even and small, and the goat Amalthea kept her warmth close beside him. And the walls of the cave held the quiet, the way stone holds heat long after the sun has gone, slowly releasing it, slowly, through the deepest hours. He grew strong in those green hills, Zeus did, fed on honey and goat milk and mountain air, and in time he was ready to take his place among the powers of the world. There had been a long struggle once between the older powers and the younger, and when it was over, the world settled into the order it has now. Olympus in its high place above the clouds, the sea given its god, the underworld its keeper, the sky held by the one who had been rocked in a cave above the sound of dancing shields and the hum of mountain bees. It had all unfolded as things do, slowly, then all at once, then slowly again. And so the world had its shape and its names and its gods in their proper places, and the people on their plains and islands went about the business of their days, planting and harvesting, sailing and resting, watching the stars for the seasons turning, setting out honey at the doorstep as the lamps came in. The old stories settled over all of it, like the sky over the earth, like the lid over the bowl, covering everything, giving everything its proper proportion of shadow and light. The mountains had their caves, the caves had their bees, the bees had their honey, and the honey was dark and warm and tasted of the mountain and the long, long summer. And over all of this, over the island and the cave and the goat grazing the mountain slopes in the thin early light, over Aphrodite newly arrived on her salt-bleached shore, over the golden meadows where the first people had lived and rested and at last grown quietly into sleep, over all of it, the night turned. Nyx moved across the world with her old, unhurried authority, and behind her came the stars, one after another, in their familiar patterns, neither hurrying nor pausing, doing what they had always done. The world breathed, the honey thickened in its comb, the sea made its patient sound against the rocks below. The dream that carried us here, the dream of the first things, of gap and earth and sky, of foam and shell and the west wind's breath, of honey in a mountain cave and the dancing of young men in the dark. That dream turns now, slowly, as dreams do, thinning at the edges, the images becoming gauze, the sounds becoming the sound of the river Lethe below the cave, water over pebbles, steady and gentle and forgetful. The creation rests inside its own story, the way the world rests inside the night, and the night is held, even now, in the wide and starry mantle of Nyx, who moves above all things and knows them and covers them gently and does not disturb their sleep. We move now upward from the first breathing of the world, past the cloud line, into the high, still air above everything. Homer knew this place well, and he described it not as a place of storms or of drama, but as the opposite of all that. On Olympus, he said, the air lay clear and cloudless, a white radiance spread like linen over the summit, and no wind ever shook it, no rain ever fell, and the cold silence of high places was softened into something the poets called, simply, peace. The halls of the gods stood there on those high slopes, built by the smith god Hephaestus out of materials that had no names in ordinary language. Only the poets attempted to describe them, and even they fell back on comparisons. Bright as bronze, smooth as water, warm as hearth light in winter. In the long cool of each evening, the gods rested there, in their own domains, each in the manner suited to their nature, the way each creature of the lower world finds its own corner of the night. Zeus rested on the highest point of the mountain, where the rock was bare and the air was thinner than breath, and the world spread below him like a great dark map. The eagle that was sacred to him sat on a nearby crag, its huge wings folded in against its body, its golden eyes half closed, drowsing in the last of the daylight. The thunder, which had spoken somewhere far to the south during the afternoon, had long since quieted. put away like a tool set down at the end of honest work. Far below the summit, in the valley of Dodona, the sacred oak of Zeus stood in a clearing, its great branches spread wide over the dark grass. The old priests there believed that the rustling of its leaves carried the gods' answers to mortal questions, and night after night they would listen to the sound the oak made in the little wind that came down from the mountain at evening, interpreting its whispers, its slow sighing, the way one leaf touched another and then grew still. It was a gentle oracle, made entirely of patience. Hera, the queen of Olympus, moved through her own halls with the slow and deliberate grace of someone who has always known exactly where she belongs. She was crowned in gold, her robe falling in long, straight folds to the floor, and about her, the peacocks that were sacred to her were settling for the night, folding their extraordinary tails, those long feathers with their eyes of blue and green and gold, drawing them in like a slowly closing fan, until they were simply birds again, quiet and warm in the lamplight. Poseidon had gone down into his halls beneath the Aegean long before the evening came, for the god of the sea moved in rhythms older than the day. Under the water, in a palace the old poets imagined as built of coral and pale stone, the great horses of the sea were quieting. They were not ordinary horses. They were the foam-crested waves themselves in another form. And as the sea above grew gentler in the dusk, the horses settled, their white manes loosening, their restless circling slowing, until the surface of the Aegean was as smooth as hammered tin. Athena kept her own kind of stillness, not the stillness of rest exactly, but the stillness of a mind that has finished its work and holds the result quietly, without needing to speak it. Her temple on the high rock of Athens was surrounded by olive trees, silver green in the dying light, their leaves turning with a soft sound when the wind came, and above the city, the owl that was sacred to her opened its great eyes as darkness gathered, beginning its patient watch. Athena, the old story said, loved the city she had given a gift. That gift was remembered long and warmly. Once, the story goes, Athena and Poseidon each wished to offer something to a new city on a rocky headland, and each gave what they could. Poseidon struck the rock with his trident, and from it sprang a salt spring, full of power and strength. Athena pressed her hand to the earth, and from it grew a small tree, its fruit silver bitter and filled with oil, its branches a shelter against the heat. The people of the city chose the olive, and so the city became hers, and she tended it for a very long time. Apollo had been at Delphi all the afternoon, where his oracles sat in the cool inner chamber of his temple, and breathed the vapors that rose from the earth below, and spoke her slow, difficult answers to the questions the world brought to her. But now the day was done, and Apollo had set down his lyre on a low table in his inner hall, and the last notes of the music he had played were still somehow present in the air, the way music lingers after it has ended, as if the sound itself is reluctant to entirely leave. The Muses, 9 daughters of memory, lived on the green slopes of Helicon, that mountain in Boeotia, where the springs were said to be sweet, and the air in the morning tasted of something almost like forgetfulness of everything difficult. They had been singing since long before the light began to fail, and now their voices were fading into the evening one by one, each song concluding in its own time, until only a low hum remained, warm and wordless. And then even that dissolved into the sound of wind among the laurels on the slope, indistinguishable from the mountain breathing. Hesiod, who was a farmer and a poet, and who claimed the Muses spoke to him once when he was tending sheep on the slopes of Helicon, wrote that the gift of the Muses is exactly this: a forgetting of sorrows, a rest from care. When the Muses sing, he said, the halls of the gods fall silent to listen, and the weights of the day, whatever troubles had accumulated, whatever small griefs, lift away like mist when the sun comes. There is no better way to describe what happens in the hour before sleep than that. Artemis came home to the forest before the moon rose. She moved through the trees with the easy familiarity of someone who has known every path since before the paths had names. The deer that followed her, the companions of her long days in the wild hills, settled among the roots of the oldest oaks, folding their slim legs beneath them, their ears still turning slowly at the small sounds of the woods at night. A branch settling, a stream finding a new stone, the soft call of an owl not far away. The hunt was over, the forest was at rest. Hephaestus was the last of the gods to stop working each evening. And this was always so, because he loved his work in the way that those who have made difficult things at great cost come to love the making itself. But at last even he would set down his tools, the tongs, the hammer, the instruments with no names in ordinary speech, and bank the great fire of his forge, drawing the coals together into a low and steady glow, and the workshop would grow quieter. The roaring of the bellows gone, only the soft tick of cooling metal remaining. On the bench beside the forge, the beautiful things Hephaestus had made were cooling, pieces whose surfaces caught even the dim glow of the dying fire and held it, transformed it into something the eye wanted to rest on. It was said that everything he made was more beautiful than anything made by mortal hands, not because he rushed or tried to impress, but because he worked very slowly, very carefully, attending to each detail as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered at that moment. The last spark floated upward from the coals. The workshop breathed out. Hermes had been traveling all day. He was always traveling, carrying messages between the worlds, between the gods, between the living and those who had gone on, moving so quickly that he seemed to appear and vanish rather than arrive and depart. But now the day was done, and even Hermes came home at dusk and sat on the low stone step of his door and unbuckled his winged sandals and set them carefully to one side. The wings folded in against the leather with a small sound, like a bird settling. For a little while the traveler was still. Apollo's lyre had fallen fully silent now, and without the music, one became aware of the other sound that was always present on Olympus in the evening. Not a sound exactly, but a quality of the air, a luminous hush, as if the white radiance Homer described was also a kind of sound, pitched too high for hearing. Night after night, this same hush settled over the mountain when the day's work was finished, and the gods, whatever they had been during the daylight hours, became simply presences in a great and quiet place, resting in the way old things rest, completely, without reservation. And then there was Hestia. She is mentioned last, but the poets were clear that she was, in fact, the eldest, the first child of her generation, the one who preceded all the drama and all the journeying and all the loud glory of the other gods. She had asked only for one thing, to keep the hearth fire at the center of Olympus and at the center of every home in the mortal world below. This she was given gladly, for it was a gift everyone understood the value of, and no one else quite wanted the responsibility. The fire she kept was never large. That was the point. It was not the fire of the forge, roaring and transforming. It was not lightning. It was not the sun. It was the small, persistent, warm fire that existed at the center of a home to say, this place is inhabited, this place is cared for, someone has chosen to stay here. Hestia was the goddess of staying. While the other gods traveled and struggled and changed the shape of the world, she remained at the hearth, and the flame she kept remained with her, neither growing nor dying, simply present. It was said, and this is one of the quiet things the old poets said, that one must listen carefully to hear it all, that the first thing done when entering any house in the ancient world was to acknowledge Hestia, not with great ceremony, but simply a small offering to the hearth fire, a gesture of recognition, the way one nods to someone who has been waiting. She was the beginning and the end of every gathering. The grace said before and after. Without her, there was no home, only a structure. With her, even the simplest room became a place of safety. So the evening settled over Olympus, and over all the domains of all the gods, and the hearth fire of Hestia burned low and steady at the center of it all. The eagle slept on its crag. The peacocks were folded into themselves, dreaming whatever peacocks dream. The forge was dark, the sandals were still, the lyre was silent, the deer lay among the roots of the ancient oaks, and the muses, on their mountain, had let their songs become the sound of wind, and the wind had become the sound of breathing, and the breathing was indistinguishable from the night itself. And the night held all of it, the summit and the forge and the olive groves and the still Aegean and the quiet oracle at Delphi, the way Hestia's fire held the house, steadily, without effort, without drawing attention to itself. This was the gift the gods gave back to the world each evening without announcement, the permission to rest. The great powers of the bright air grew still, one by one, and the world below them, feeling that stillness descend like something cool and soft, turned in its own turning and grew quieter, and the dark came on, gentle as a hand that knows just how lightly to settle. We move now down from the bright air of Olympus, down through the turning of the light, into the green and breathing world below. There was a meadow, somewhere in the wide land of Sicily, or perhaps in Arcadia. The old poets were never quite certain, and perhaps it did not matter. A meadow where the grass grew thick and soft, and the air in the early morning carried the particular sweetness of narcissus, which is both honey and something deeper, something older, the scent of the earth itself opening. Persephone, young daughter of Demeter the grain goddess, had come to this meadow on a bright and unhurried morning. She walked among the flowers with no particular destination in mind, which is the best kind of walking. Roses grew in low clusters near the edge of the field. Crocuses, violet and gold, pushed up between the grasses. The narcissus stood tall and very sweet, and the earth had grown them especially that day, it was said, with unusual care, as though the ground itself had something it wanted to offer. She gathered as she walked, filling her arms slowly, bending low for the crocuses, reaching up for the tallest narcissus, moving in the unhurried way of someone who has the whole morning and knows it. The bees were already working, moving from flower to flower with their small and serious industry. The light came at a long angle across the grass, and the shadows of the flower stems lay thin and gentle on the earth. For a long while, the meadow held only that ordinary sweetness, that ordinary brightness. She wandered a little apart, toward one particularly tall narcissus that grew at the edge of the meadow where the grass gave way to something darker, something softer underfoot. She reached for it, and then the world grew still and quiet, and Persephone passed, for a season, into the kingdom below, where Hades is lord of the silent dead, not unkind, only solemn, the keeper of the deep. The narcissus remained where it had been. The meadow remained. Only the girl was gone, and the air above the grass felt for a moment very gentle. Demeter did not know at first. She waited as a mother waits with patience that has not yet become worry. But the afternoon grew long, and the evening came, and Persephone did not return. And then Demeter walked out onto the hills with a torch in each hand, calling into the darkening air. The torches were great ones, cut from pine, and they threw orange light across the hillsides, and their smoke rose straight up into the still autumn sky, and her voice carried far, but there was no answer. She walked the whole earth searching. That is how the old story goes, neither eating nor resting, carrying her torches over mountains and across plains, through olive groves grown dim and silent, along the edges of rivers that moved dark and slow in the early autumn chill. 9 days she walked, and 9 nights, and the torches burned on, and still there was no answer. The earth around her, feeling the grief of the one who had always tended it, began very slowly to change. The leaves at the tips of the branches grew tired. The leaves let go. It happened slowly, the way grief itself works. Not all at once, but one by one, in small surrenders, until the branches were bare and the ground was covered with what had been green. The fields, which Demeter had always walked through each year with her hands open, the grain rising in her wake, now stood empty and cold. The furrows were hard. The seed did not stir. Cattle stood in the bare fields and breathed out steam in the cold air. And the farmers looked at the sky and did not understand what they had done wrong. This was the first winter the world had ever known. It was, in its own way, a kind of quiet, a tremendous, cold, waiting quiet that settled over the land the way snow settles, covering everything softly, making the world unfamiliar. The birds flew south and did not return. The ground hardened underfoot. The sky stayed low and gray for days at a time, and the light when it came was thin and white and gave no warmth. The world was not cruel. It was simply holding its breath, as a world does, while a mother grieves. At last, worn and grieving, Demeter came to Eleusis, a town not far from the sea, where a well stood near the road, shaded by an old olive tree whose branches were winter bare. She sat beside it, disguised as an old woman, wrapped in a dark mantle, and rested. She had not rested in a very long time. The stone of the well curb was cold beneath her, and the wind came in off the sea with a smell of salt and turned earth, and she sat very still and did not weep, because she had moved beyond the stage of weeping. The daughters of the king of Eleusis came to the well to draw water, and they found the old woman sitting there in her dark mantle, and they spoke to her gently, as kind girls do when they find someone sitting alone in the cold. They brought her into the great house, and the king's wife, Metanira, received her warmly and offered her a seat by the fire. Demeter sat, and the hearth fire was the first warmth she had been near in all those cold weeks, and it reached her slowly, the way warmth reaches someone who has been cold for a very long time. For a long while Demeter sat in silence, and the household moved carefully around her, sensing that she was a woman carrying something heavy, though they did not know what. A serving girl named Iambe, quick and warm-spirited, came and sat nearby and began to talk. Small things, ordinary things, a little gently foolish, and she coaxed from Demeter something that was almost a smile. Not laughter, not yet, but the faint easing that comes just before. The face remembering that it knows how to soften. The hearth fire popped and settled. The room smelled of wood smoke and warm bread. The household had a young infant, a boy called Demophon, and Metanira asked the old woman if she would tend the child through the nights, for he was small and needed watching. Demeter agreed, and so each night she sat by the hearth with the sleeping child in her arms, rocking him very gently in the firelight. She breathed slowly, and he breathed slowly, and the fire breathed slowly. And in that room, for those hours, the grief was still there, but it was held the way a very heavy thing can be held when one is sitting down and not required to move. Those nights at Eleusis were a kind of pause inside the long sorrow, the goddess of grain sitting up in a mortal house, keeping the ordinary warmth of a hearth, watching a child sleep. Outside the house the world was cold and bare and still did not grow. But inside the fire held and the child breathed, and time moved in the slow good way it moves when there is nothing required of it but to pass. Eventually, even a goddess must rest, and even grief has its rhythms, and the night moved on, as all nights do, toward the first pale suggestion of morning. At last the news came to Demeter of where her daughter had gone, carried, the old stories say, by the sun god Helios, who sees everything from his high chariot, and had seen the passing into quiet, and told her gently. And so arrangements were made, as arrangements are made between the great powers of the world, with care and with difficulty and with long deliberation. It was settled that Persephone would return. The earth breathed in, very slowly, as though it had been holding its breath for a long time and had only just been told that it was safe to breathe again. But there was the matter of the pomegranate. In the quiet kingdom below, Persephone had tasted a few of its seeds, only a few, only the smallest taste. And by the old law that governs such things, a taste of the food of a place binds one to it, in part forever. And so the time was divided. Some months below, in the still and solemn kingdom, where Persephone was not unhappy, only quiet, and the rest of the year above, in the light, with her mother. This was how it was settled, and how it has been ever since. The pomegranate, country people used to say, was the sign of the promise. To eat its seeds was to promise to return. And so it was set out at the year's turning, a small red thing on a stone sill, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever passes into the winter dark will come back with the spring. The fruit contains more seeds than anyone counts. It is very red, the pomegranate, and very sweet and very old, and it has always seemed to those who look at it carefully like a fruit that is thinking about something. And when Persephone returned, when the agreed time came and she came back up from the quiet into the light, Demeter's joy ran out across the world so quickly and so completely that the earth could barely keep up. The narcissus opened first, pushing up through ground that had been cold and hard for months, very white and very sweet. Then the crocus, violet and gold. Then the wheat, greening in long, slow waves across the fields. The color of the wheat so particular and so vivid after the winter gray that it was almost a sound, almost a note of music. The bees returned. The birds returned from wherever the south had kept them, arriving first as small dark shapes crossing a sky that was suddenly a cleaner and more hopeful blue. Lambs stood in the green fields on uncertain legs. The olive trees put out new leaves, very small and silver green and bright, trembling in the April air. And Demeter walked through all of it with her hands open, and the grain rose in her wake as it always had, as it always will, season by season, year by year, for as long as the world keeps its turning. And every year, when the daughter goes back down into the quiet, the world follows her in its gentle way. The wheat is harvested and the stubble stands golden and still. The leaves go, one by one, as grief works, and the light changes from summer gold to something thinner, something that rests more softly on the ground. The air smells of turned earth and cold coming. The world does not resist. It folds itself slowly as a tired person folds into bed, pulling the dark over itself with a kind of relief, and rests through the long, quiet months until the return. This is the whole story. The year breathing in and out. Spring is the mother's joy, running out across the earth at her daughter's return. Winter is the mother's quiet waiting, and the world's quiet waiting with her. Autumn is the gentle letting go, the walking down, the pomegranate seeds remembered. And the narcissus, which blooms at the year's bright beginning, is the flower that started it all, the one Persephone reached for on a soft morning, in a meadow somewhere in Sicily or Arcadia, while the bees moved in their small and serious circles and the light came long across the grass. So the seasons settled into their rhythm, and the farmers learned to read them, the first crocus as a promise, the first cold as a time to wait, the swelling of the pomegranate as the sign of what always returns. The world had been, for a little while, without growing things, and it had not forgotten that winter. It remembered it every year, and in the remembering found the spring more sweet. The story passed from grandmother to grandchild, told in the evenings when the harvest was in and the fire was lit, and the long nights had just begun to lengthen toward winter. We move now from the warmth of the hearth fire and the harvest smell of grain, up and out into the open night, where the air is cool and still, and the whole dome of the sky tilts slowly overhead. The Greeks did not only read their stories in the earth and the sea. They read them above, in the dark vault, salted with light, and every figure that circled the pole or rose at the horizon's edge carried a name, a memory, a quiet tale that had been told so many times it had become as steady as the stars themselves. There was a bear in the northern sky, great and slow, turning always around the still point of the pole, her 7 bright stars tracing the same wide circle night after night through every season and every year, never dipping below the horizon, never lost in the sea. The farmers knew her, the sailors knew her. The children lying on rooftops in summer watched her turn above them with a kind of comfort, as one watches a familiar face moving through a lamp-lit room, unhurried, steady, going nowhere at all except around and around. The story of how she came to be there was told gently in the old evenings. There had been a companion of Artemis, a young woman who loved the forested hills and the cool shade of deep groves, and through circumstances the old poets described in various ways, she was changed, in a moment of stillness, into a great bear, and wandered the wooded slopes alone. Her name was Callisto, and for a long while she moved through the world she had once known. The same oak trees above her, the same streams, though everything had altered. Her son, Arcas, grew up in the world of men and became a hunter, skilled and quiet in the hills, knowing the tracks of animals the way a reader knows letters on a page. And there came a moment, the old story says, when he might have met his mother in the forest without knowing her for what she was. But Zeus, who watched the wide world from above, saw the meeting before it could unfold in any unhappy way, and with great gentleness, the gentleness the sky has when it simply opens and receives, lifted them both into the stars. So Callisto became the great bear, Ursa Major, wheeling wide around the pole, and Arcas became the little bear beside her, smaller, his own circle tighter and closer to the still center of the sky. They do not set, they do not sink below the dark rim of the horizon into the sea. They simply turn and turn and turn, together and endlessly, through every summer night and every winter night and every night that falls between, the two of them safe in the one place where nothing can reach them, ceaselessly held in the sky's quiet keeping. Nearer the southern arc of the winter sky, there was another figure, larger and more brilliant, rising with the cold months and filling the night with a kind of grandeur that the old poets found both beautiful and comforting. Orion, the great hunter, stood at his station on the turning sky with 3 stars belted across his middle, 3 in a perfect row, evenly spaced, so clearly intentional that every shepherd and every sailor who looked up recognized them at once. The same 3, always the same, as if someone had drawn a careful line across the dark. At his heel followed Sirius, the brightest of all the stars, blazing white and steady, the great dog whose rising in summer announced the hottest days of the year. Sailors making their way through the dark Aegean would look for Orion's belt and know at once which way the shore lay and which way the open sea, and feel, perhaps, something like reassurance, as if the night, vast and wordless as it was, had placed landmarks in itself for the sake of those who traveled below. The hunter moved across his quarter of the sky and asked for nothing in return. Eastward and upward from Orion's shoulder, if the night was clear and the eye was patient and let itself go soft rather than searching too hard, there was a small, soft cluster, neither a single star nor a constellation, but something between, a faint smear of light that resolved, on a dark night far from any fire, into a tiny gathering of stars, close together, as though keeping one another company. These were the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, daughters of the Titan Atlas, who carried the weight of the sky on his great shoulders, while his daughters shone above him, as if in consolation. Hesiod, who knew the stars the way a farmer must know them to survive, wrote in his Works and Days of how the Pleiades told the year's turnings as plainly as any calendar. When they rose before dawn in May, it was time to begin the harvest. When they set in autumn, it was time to plow. The farmer who watched the sisters did not need a priest or a scholar to tell him when the season had changed. He had only to look up before sunrise, and the sky told him everything he needed in the same soft cluster it had always used, patient as the year itself. Of the 7 sisters, there was one, the old stories agreed, who showed herself less brightly than the rest, her light dimmer and harder to find, so that on some nights she seemed almost not to be there at all. She was said to be the sister who veiled her face, for reasons the poets gave in different ways. Perhaps a shyness, perhaps a tenderness that did not want to shine too openly. Perhaps simply the way some lights are, quieter than their companions, no less present for being harder to see. She was called Merope, and she was there if one looked long enough and with patience. In another quarter of the sky, slightly north and east, there was a small family placed together among the stars as if the sky itself had wanted to keep them near one another. Cassiopeia, a queen, sat in her chair of stars and turned slowly around the pole in a long circuit that brought her sometimes upright, and sometimes, on the other side of the night, tilted at an angle that gave her a look of easy repose, as though she had leaned back into the enormous chair of the heavens and decided to rest there night after night, undisturbed and content. Beside her and below moved Andromeda, her daughter, traced in a long chain of stars that stretched from the square of Pegasus across the autumn sky. And Perseus, the hero who had traveled far through the world, stood near them both, his own stars a-clustering not far from the great cloud of the Pleiades, as if he too had come to rest near people he knew. The poets were glad that the sky had set them there together, the queen in her chair, the princess in her long chain of starlight, the hero nearby, a quiet family held in the sky's enormous patience, untroubled by anything. There was a small crown in the northern sky, a semicircle of stars arranged in a gentle arc, modest and bright, that the Greeks called the northern crown, Corona Borealis, though the Greeks themselves knew it as Ariadne's crown. Ariadne had helped a hero find his way through a darkness and had been set in time among the stars by Dionysus, who loved her. The crown itself, a gift, a memory, a circlet of light, was placed in the sky as a kind of lasting token, and it shone there still, a small arc of stars quietly keeping its shape above the turning world. And then there was the Milky Way, which was not a constellation, but something older and stranger and harder to name, a river of faint light that poured itself across the entire dome of the sky from one horizon to the other, not the blazing of any single star, but the gathered glow of so many stars too distant and too numerous to count, all of them blurring together into that soft, wide road of light. The Greeks had different names for it. Some called it a path, some called it a river, and the story of spilled milk and a startled goddess was among the tales they told to explain that slow, astonishing brightness. On nights when the moon was new and the air was clear, those nights that happened a handful of times a year when everything came together just right, the Milky Way was bright enough to cast a faint shadow on pale stone, and a person standing alone on a hilltop above the sea could feel, the old stories suggest, as though the sky were a road, and it was possible, just possible, to step off the dark earth and walk along it. The sensation would pass, as all sensations pass, but the road would remain, spilling its quiet light from one end of the night to the other. A shepherd who spent his nights on the hillsides above the sea, as shepherds in the old world did, needed no book and no teacher to read the sky. He knew, from years of watching, that the Great Bear never set, that she turned faithfully around the pole through every season and could always be trusted to show him north when the clouds parted and the stars came back. He knew that when Orion climbed high in the south, the cold had arrived and would stay a while. He knew the Pleiades as he knew the faces of old neighbors, and their slow drift across the seasons marked his year as clearly as any counting of days. He would lie back on the warm, dry grass, warm even at night in summer, holding the heat of the day long into the dark hours, and let the sky fill his entire vision, the whole turning dome of it. The bear slowly wheeling, the scorpion setting in the west as Orion rose in the east, as if they were keeping a careful distance from one another. The Pleiades moving like a small, soft lantern on a string. And he would feel, as people sometimes feel when they are very tired and very still, and the night is very large, that they are not quite separate from it all, that the turning of the sky is also a kind of breathing. And so he would sleep. Not because he decided to sleep, and not because he was finished watching the sky, but because the watching itself had become so peaceful, and the sky so large and steady above him, that the boundary between wakefulness and sleep grew soft and permeable, the way the edge of a river in still weather grows hard to find, where exactly the water ends and the reflected sky begins. The stars did not stop turning when he slept. The bear completed her circuit without him. Orion moved across his quarter of the sky. The Pleiades drifted west, unhurried, tending to their own quiet business. The sky, the old stories suggest, did not require anyone to watch it in order to continue. It turned because that was its nature. The way Hypnos breathed in the sunless cave below the world, slow and even, whether anyone stood at the entrance listening or not. The river Lethe murmured over its pale stones in the dark, and the poppies at the cave's mouth moved gently in the breath that came up from underground, a breath neither warm nor cold, exactly the temperature of sleep. The dreams shifted in their soft places, formless still, waiting to become whatever the night required of them. Hypnos himself reclined on his couch of black down, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, the way sleep itself is never quite one thing or the other at its edges. His mother Nyx had drawn her dark cloak across the world as she did every night, and the stars that pricked through the fabric of it were, in the old telling, simply the lights that showed through. The shepherds slept on the hillside. The sailors slept in their rocking hulls. The farmers slept in their stone houses with the grain stored safe, and the sky turned above all of them, steady and immense, caring for them in the only way the sky knows how, by staying. The stars were stories, and the stories were true in the way that only very old things are true, not as a record of events that could be checked, but as a record of what it has always felt like to lie down under the open sky and look up and feel the turning of something much larger than oneself, patient and indifferent, and also somehow kind. The crown of Ariadne shone in its small arc. The hunter stood at his post. The sisters clustered softly in their corner of the dark, and the whole sky turned as it has always turned, carrying everything placed within it gently around and around through the long warm night into the first pale softening of the east. We drift now from the wide turning sky down into a quieter kind of story, the sort that begins, as all the oldest ones do, with a king and 3 daughters. The eldest 2 were lovely enough in the way that many things are lovely, easily noticed, easily passed. But the youngest, whose name was Psyche, had about her something the eye could not quite move past, a stillness and a light together. And people walking through the market would slow without meaning to, and stand and simply look at her for a long, unhurried moment, the way one stands before the sea. Such loveliness is a strange kind of gift, the old stories agree. It draws the world's gaze but can make the world feel very far away at the same time, like standing always at a window, admired from the outside, while the ordinary warmth of things remains just out of reach. So Psyche, for all that people stopped to look at her, found the days quiet and a little lonely. Her sisters married and went to their husbands' houses, as was the way of things, and she remained in her father's home, and the evenings grew long, and the lamp burned low each night over an empty table. It was into this quietness that Eros came, the young god of love, he who carried a small bow and arrows tipped with something the old poets never quite named, only agreed was very powerful. He had been sent, the story goes, on an errand of sorts, to visit the sleeping girl in the night. But in that first unguarded moment of arrival, he caught one of his own small arrows against his own hand, the oldest soft joke in all of Olympus, and found that he had fallen in love with her before he had even meant to. He stood very still in the dark. Outside, the night wind moved through the fig trees. What followed was arranged by love itself, as such things often are in the oldest tales, with a gentleness that resembles something almost like weather. A warm west wind came for Psyche one soft evening, not startling, not sudden, only a great lifting breath of air that smelled of distant blossoms and something sweet it is difficult to name, and it carried her, the way a wave carries a leaf, up and across the sky, and down again into a green valley she had never seen, where the grass was the deep particular green of a place the sun reaches generously, and the air was warm and unhurried, and everything was very still and very kind. At the heart of the valley there was a palace, and the palace was the kind that exists most fully in the imagination of those who have always loved beautiful things. Its columns pale as new milk, its floors inlaid with stones the colors of still water, its gardens full of roses that bloomed even in the half-dark under the trees. Psyche walked through it slowly, one hand trailing along a cool marble wall, and unseen voices came softly out of the air around her, offering water, food, rest, gentle and without urgency, the way a good house feels when it has been long and happily lived in. And music, too, it seemed to come from the walls themselves, or from somewhere just past hearing. The sound of a lyre played very softly, unhurried as a river. By night the husband came, gentle and unhurried, his voice warm and easy in the dark, and he asked only one small thing, that she wait, that she trust him a little while, that she not yet lift a lamp to look upon his face, for the time was not yet right. It was a simple asking and kindly meant, and Psyche, who was not by nature a fearful person, found it easy enough to agree, there in the warm dark, with the music still faintly running somewhere just beneath the silence. For a long and easy season, Psyche lived inside that happiness, and the valley held her gently, and the days turned one into the next, the way good days do, without insisting on themselves, without urgency, full of small pleasures. The cool of morning on the stone floor, the smell of bread from somewhere inside the palace, the sound of the unseen fountains turning in the garden, the warmth of the afternoon light across the roses, and each night the same quiet voice, the same warmth, the same gentleness. There are lives that ask nothing of a person for a little while, and this was one of them, and she was in her way entirely content. But longing is a patient thing, and it grows in quiet. Not fear, the story is clear on this, not suspicion, nothing dark or troubled, only the particular ache of wanting to see the face of someone who has been kind to her in the dark for so many nights, wanting to put a shape to the warmth. One night, when he had fallen into deep and even sleep beside her, Psyche rose very quietly, the way one moves in a room where something is sleeping, and she lit a small oil lamp she had kept without quite meaning to, and she lifted it, slowly, slowly, and turned toward the bed. And what she saw was not anything to fear. It was Eros himself, the young god of love, asleep, his face turned slightly toward the light, his features so composed and so lovely in sleep that she felt the breath leave her body entirely, not in fright, but in something closer to the feeling of a door opening onto a large and unexpected room. His soft wings were folded at his back like pale feathers laid flat, and beside the bed his small bow lay quiet, and the arrows rested in their case, and everything about the scene was still and tender and entirely without danger. She looked for a long, still moment. Outside, the night was enormous and soft. She looked for too long, perhaps, or perhaps the lamp itself was moved by the same wonder she felt. For in that long, trembling moment, a single warm drop of oil slipped from the lamp's lip and fell and touched his shoulder, gently as a word said too soon. Eros stirred. His eyes opened in the amber light, and he looked at her with an expression the old poet struggled to name. Not anger, not grief exactly, only a kind of sorrowful tenderness, the look of one who had hoped for a little more time. He rose from the couch very softly, the way a dream thins at the edges when morning comes, and he passed through the dark air and was gone, and the lamp burned on alone. The valley was very quiet after that. The roses were still there, the fountains still turning, the marble still cool underfoot. But the quality of the silence had changed, the way a room changes when someone has just left it, the air slightly rearranged. Psyche sat for a while in the garden, the lamp still warm in her hands, and the sorrow she felt was not the sharp kind but the wide kind, the kind that feels like open water, not frightening, only large. She understood, in the slow way that understanding comes in the early morning, that she would need to walk out into the world again, and that walking was the only road back to what she loved. So Psyche set out with a patient heart and no particular map, which is the equipment most fairy tale journeys require and most fairy tale journeys receive. The world through which she walked was the ordinary world. Dusty roads and olive trees, the smell of thyme crushed underfoot, the sound of distant goat bells in the hills, the long blue afternoons of a country where the sun is serious about its work. She was looking for the one she had seen by lamplight, and the road was long, and she walked it without hurrying, because hurrying rarely finds what is genuinely lost, and patience is a kind of map of its own. There came a day when the road brought her to a great storehouse, and inside the storehouse was a heap, an enormous, patient, impossible heap, of seeds and grains all tumbled together, lentils mixed with millet, millet with barley, barley with poppy seed, every kind of small thing stirred together into confusion, and the task, it seemed, was to sort them. She sat down before the heap and looked at it for a long while, the way one sits before something too large to know how to begin. And then, from the cool earthen floor and from the cracks in the stone walls, there came a long, quiet line of ants, small, deliberate, entirely certain, and they began, without a word, to sort. They worked through the evening and into the blue hour before moonrise, those ants, each one lifting something smaller than itself and carrying it precisely to the right place, with a sureness that had no anxiety in it, only the steady industry of creatures who understand that large things are made of small actions done carefully. Psyche watched them and felt something ease in her chest, the tightness that comes from believing one must manage everything alone. By the time the first stars appeared in the gap of the storehouse door, the heap was sorted into its perfect separate piles, each grain with its own kind, and the floor was clean, and the ants had gone quietly back to wherever ants go at night. The road gave her other small tasks, in the way of roads in the oldest stories, never cruel, only testing, the way water tests the shape of stone gently and over time. There was bright wool to be gathered from a flock that rested near a river at noon, and the river itself had a green reed growing at its bend, a long, particular reed that leaned into the current and seemed to have been listening to the river for a very long time. When Psyche sat beside it in the cool of the evening, the reed bent toward her and whispered, just at the edge of hearing, exactly how to gather the wool safely from the briar where it had caught in the last soft hour before dusk. And there was water to be carried from a high cold spring at the top of a steep gray crag, and the crag was the kind of place where the wind lives permanently and the path is narrow, and the jar she carried was heavy and smooth, and it seemed for a little while that the task was simply impossible, which is the moment in fairy tales when something arrives. An eagle came, riding the thermal currents far above, wide-winged and patient, and it descended in long spirals until it was close, and it took the jar very gently in its talons, with a care that seemed enormous and ancient at once, and flew up to the spring and filled it and brought it back full and set it down without spilling a drop. There is a kindness in the world, the old stories seem to be saying through all of this, that moves through small creatures and patient rivers and wide-winged birds, a kindness that does not announce itself, that does not require gratitude, that simply comes when it is needed, like shade in the afternoon, like the smell of rain before it arrives. Psyche carried what she was given and walked on, and the road grew quieter as it went, and the light grew softer, and the air had about it the particular quality of late afternoon in autumn when everything is golden and a little tired, and the world seems to be preparing itself, without hurry, for rest. And then, at the end of that long, good road, the last gift came. Not a task, not a challenge, only rest itself, which is sometimes the thing the road has been leading toward all along. A deep and sweet sleep came over Psyche, the way nightfall comes, gradually and then entirely, and she lay down in the soft grass at the side of the path, in a hollow where the thyme grew thick and the light was amber and fading, and all the weariness of all that walking was set down, the way one sets down a heavy thing that has been carried a long way, and the silence of real sleep closed around her, and she did not dream and did not need to. Eros had been searching too, in the way that love searches, not loudly, not with torches and urgency, but with the particular attentiveness of one who is paying very close attention to the world, waiting to recognize what is already known. He found her the way the old stories always arrange such findings quietly, without fanfare, in a field, in the fading light. He landed softly beside her in the grass, his wings settling, and he looked at her face for a long and gentle while, the way she had once looked at his face by lamplight, with that same particular wonder, that same forgetting to breathe. And then very lightly, as one lifts a petal, he wiped the sleep from her eyes with the tip of one finger. And she opened her eyes, and he was there. The story does not spend long on this moment, because it does not need to. Some things are complete simply in their happening, like the first warm day of spring, like the sound of rain beginning on dry ground. The gods, who had watched all of this with the patient interest they take in matters of the heart, welcomed Psyche among them, and she was given a kind of immortality that felt less like a gift and more like a recognition, as though she had always been on her way here. She and Eros were married in the way of the old stories, and their child was given the name Joy, which is, the old poets agreed, a very suitable name for the child of love and the soul. Psyche, her name in the old language, means simply the soul, and her sign is the butterfly, the small pale creature that navigates by the feeling of warmth on its wings and is drawn always toward the light. The Romans loved this story too, and kept it long after the Greek world had quieted, which tells something about the kind of story it is. Not a tale of power or cleverness or war, but a tale about the patience of love and the patience of the soul, which are sometimes the same patience, wearing different faces. And the small butterfly still drifts in the lamplight, tilting toward the flame, not quite touching, and the cave of Hypnos is warm and very still, and the poppies nod at the threshold, and the river runs on over its pale stones. We move now down from the bright palaces and their old love stories into the green and unhurried world of Arcadia, the mountainous heart of the Peloponnese, where the poets always imagined the simplest life. Here the pine woods climb the rocky slopes in long, dark columns, and the springs run cold even in midsummer, and the air in the morning carries the smell of thyme and pine resin, and the particular sweetness of wet stone. No temples stand very tall here. The gods of this place are smaller and quieter, and they move through the world the way a breeze moves through tall grass. Pan was the god of this green world, son of Hermes, as the old songs told it, and born with the small curved horns of a goat and the rough legs of one, and the broad, cheerful face of a god who has never once been troubled by ceremony or the opinions of the other powers of Olympus. He loved the high meadows and the rocky passes and the sound of water in a narrow canyon, and he had no palace, no polished throne, no court of attendants. He had the hills, and that was enough, and more than enough, for Pan had always known how to be content with what the land gave freely. At midday, when the sun stood directly overhead and the whole world seemed to pause inside the heat, Pan slept. The shepherds knew this, and their flocks knew it too, and all of Arcadia lay down together in the long noon hush. The dogs stretched flat in patches of shade, the goats tucking their chins to their chests, the shepherds pulling their cloaks over their faces and letting the cicadas fill the silence. The old people warned their children never to disturb the noon quiet, for it was Pan's sleeping hour, and a sleeping god resting in the warm grass deserved the same courtesy as any tired creature. The cicadas were the sound of that noon hour, not a noise exactly, but a kind of thickness in the air, a shrilling that went on so steadily it became indistinguishable from the heat itself, from the smell of pine resin softening in the sun, from the way the light turned white and flat and shadowless at the highest point of the day. In that stillness, even the leaves of the poplars by the stream hung motionless, and the stream itself seemed to slow, its voice dropping to the quietest possible murmur. Everything waited together for the afternoon to begin its long, unhurried turn toward evening. But it was in the evenings that Pan played his pipes, when the heat had finally broken and the long blue shadows came down the valleys, and the air turned soft and carried sound farther than it had any right to travel. The sound of the syrinx, his reed pipe, drifted over the hillsides in the dusk, and it was a sound that seemed to belong to the place itself more than to any player, as if the hills were simply humming something they had always known. A shepherd hearing it far off might stop walking and stand very still, listening, not quite certain where the sound was coming from, only certain that it was beautiful. There is a gentle story about how the syrinx came to be, and it begins as so many Arcadian stories begin, beside a river. Along the banks where the tall river reeds grew thick and green and swayed in the faintest breath of wind, Pan once sat alone in the late afternoon, listening. The wind passed through the hollow reeds and made a sound. Not exactly music, not exactly the voice of water, but something between the two, something that seemed almost to be trying to say something, if only the listener were patient enough and still enough to hear it. Pan sat very quietly for a long time, head tilted, listening to that sound. After a long while, Pan cut several of the reeds, carefully, with the patience of someone who understands that the thing he wants is already present and needs only to be gathered, not forced. He cut them at different lengths, because the wind had shown him that length was everything, that a shorter reed sang higher and a longer one murmured lower, and that together, side by side, they could hold the whole range of that river sound between them. He bound them with a length of grass and lifted them to his lips, and the music that came out was the sound of the river itself, the sound of the wind in the hollow stems, the sound of the Arcadian afternoon, preserved and portable, and his to carry anywhere the hills took him. The naiads were the quiet powers of the springs and streams, not grand divine figures, but the particular felt life of water in a specific place, the way a certain spring at the foot of a hill always ran cold and clear even in August, the way its sound changed subtly after rain. The shepherds and farmers of Arcadia knew them as presences rather than persons, and they offered small gifts at the water's edge: a cup of milk left on a flat stone, a little honey, a garland of late summer flowers, floated out onto the surface and carried away by the current, which was thanks enough, and more than enough, for the water that had kept the flock through a dry summer. The dryads lived in the oaks, not inside the wood exactly, the old poets clarified, but in the life of the tree itself, so that a very old oak carried within it a very old presence, something that had watched the same hillside for longer than any shepherd could remember, through droughts and mild years and the slow change of the seasons. An oak wood in Arcadia had a particular quality of hush about it, the light coming in broken and green and stippled, the ground soft with old leaves that muffled every footstep, the air cool even when the hillside above was blazing. A herdsman walking his animals through such a wood always walked a little more quietly than usual, without quite knowing why. The Oreads were the nymphs of the hills themselves. The high places, the rocky passes, the cool air above the tree line, where the light was different and the silence was different, and a person standing alone could see the whole Peloponnese spread out below in its complicated folds and greens and grays. The Oreads were said to run through those high places in the gray hours before dawn, or in the last of the evening, when the sky still held light, but the valleys were already in shadow. The shepherds who worked the high summer pastures sometimes thought they heard light, quick footsteps on the rocks above them in the early morning, but by the time they looked up, there was only the pale sky and the wind and the sound of a loosened pebble rolling. And there was Echo, who belonged to the Arcadian hills as thoroughly as the pines did, or the cold springs, or the smell of crushed oregano underfoot. Echo's story had a complicated middle that the old people sometimes set aside in the telling, keeping only the part that mattered most, the part that was still true every day, that in the mountains of Arcadia, a voice called out into a valley always came back, softened. Not the same sound returned, exactly. Something smaller and gentler, the last syllable only, the trailing end of the word, as if the hills were taking what was given to them and giving back the quietest piece of it, the part that needed the least effort to receive. The old people of those mountain villages said that Echo was still there, still answering, still returning the last word of every call that the hills received. Not from grief any longer, not from any complicated feeling, but simply because that was what she had become. And what she had become was a kind of gift, really. The certainty that nothing said into the open air of those mountains was entirely lost, that the landscape itself was listening and would answer in its own time and in its own gentle, abbreviated way. A child calling to a friend across a valley and hearing the hills give back a soft whisper of it was, without knowing it, meeting Echo, the way one meets old things, without ceremony, without introduction. In the long afternoons, when Pan had woken from his noon sleep and the shade had shifted and the air had begun its slow cooling toward evening, the shepherds sometimes held their singing matches. These were peaceful contests, judged by no authority grander than a neighbor, and awarded a prize of no greater value than a carved wooden cup or a young goat not yet old enough to be of much use, which gave the losing shepherd something to complain about pleasantly for weeks afterward. The singers sat across the hillside from each other, trading verses, and the verses were always about the same unhurried things: the quality of a particular spring's water, the behavior of bees, the shade of the plane tree that grew beside the lower pasture. Theocritus, the poet who loved these scenes best, wrote them down in the 3rd century before the Common Era, sitting probably far from Arcadia himself, in Alexandria, it was said, surrounded by the flat, hot city. But writing from memory, or from longing, or from both, because Arcadia was always as much a feeling as a place, a feeling of the afternoon lengthening toward evening, the work mostly done, the air cooling, nothing urgently required of anyone for a little while. His shepherds speak in verses so simple and so carefully made that reading them is like watching someone lay stones in a wall. The pleasure is in the fit of one piece against another, the quiet craft of it. The bees were always in the singing matches, because the bees were always in Arcadia itself, working the thyme and the oregano and the clover in a low, steady hum that formed a kind of ground note under all the other sounds of a summer afternoon. Under the cicadas, under the trickle of the spring, under the distant tinkling of the sheep bells. Arcadian honey was famous across the Greek world, dark and fragrant, and carrying in it something of the particular resin of the pines, something of the wild herbs on the limestone hills. A shepherd tasting it on his finger at the end of the day tasted in some way the whole afternoon behind him, the sun, the time, the labor of 10,000 small bright wings. As the singing matches went on, the shadows grew longer down the valley, and the quality of the light shifted from the hard white of afternoon to something softer and more golden, the kind of light that made even an ordinary hillside look like somewhere a person would want to stay forever. The goats became restless in the way goats become restless at evening, beginning to drift without any particular plan toward the place they slept. And the dogs roused themselves from their midday stupor and began to pace. And the singers, still trading their unhurried verses about springs and shade and the sweetness of figs, let the contest dissolve without a verdict, which was by then the only natural ending. The grotto at the head of the spring was a cool and green and particular place. Limestone carved by water into a shallow cave, the walls always damp and dark, hung with maidenhair fern and the small pale flowers that grow where light is scarce and moisture is constant. The spring emerged at the back of the grotto without any drama, simply welling up in a clear pool between two mossy rocks, cold enough to numb the fingers, and flowing out over a lip of stone, worn smooth by the hands of generations of shepherds, filling their cups. The sound of it in the grotto was close and intimate, a small sound made larger by the enclosing rock, like a voice in a quiet room. Night in Arcadia came slowly, the sky deepening through all its blues before it reached the dark, and the stars appearing one by one in the order they always appeared, the shepherds knowing them the way they knew the landmarks of their pastures, by use, by repetition, by the particular comfort of things that could be counted on. The first stars were the old shepherd's stars, the ones that told the time of year, that said when to bring the flocks down from the high summer pastures and when the rains would come and when the long dry season would break. Pan's pipe, if it had been playing in the dusk, was quiet now. The hills were quiet. The springs ran on in the dark, finding their way by feel, the way water always does. The shepherd's hut was a small thing, stone-built, low-roofed, smelling of lanolin and wood smoke, and the particular animal warmth of a flock settled for the night in the pen outside. Inside, a lamp burned on the windowsill, and somewhere in the dark hills, in a place between the pines where the ground was soft with needles and the air smelled of resin and the cold of the stream below, Pan slept again, as he had slept at noon, as he would sleep again tomorrow at noon, as he had slept every night since the hills were first named. His reed pipe lay beside him on the ground, still faintly carrying in its hollow chambers the smell of the river where it had been cut. The river running on below in the dark, finding the sea by its ancient and unhurried route. The Arcadian night settled over everything, over the oaks and the springs and the grots and the sleeping flock, gently, the way sleep itself settles, without announcement. And the cave of Hypnos, far and near at once, the way the things of dreams are far and near, received all of this. The cicadas and the springs and the pipe sound and the shepherd's lamp and the breathing of the flock absorbed it the way the river Lethe absorbed everything, gently and without remainder. The poppy heads nodding at the threshold, the formless dreams drifting in and out among the darkened corridors, carrying their soft burdens. The Arcadian night and the cave of Hypnos were not so different, really, in the end. Both dark, both quiet, both full of the sound of water, both the kind of place where even a troubled mind might finally gratefully let go of the day and rest. We drift now, as smoke drifts from an evening lamp, toward the warmth of another story. For within the cave of Hypnos, among the drowsing dreams, there is always one that smells of ripe figs and wine and the sea at dusk. It is the dream that belongs to Dionysus, youngest of the great gods, who came into the world trailing the scent of the vine and the slow warmth of an autumn afternoon. His was not the bright governance of sky or sea, but something quieter and older in the human heart. The easing of the day's long knot, the gentle unfolding that comes when the work is set down at last. The old poets told many things about this god, and one of the oldest and most beloved stories goes like this. There was a day with the Aegean lying flat and bright as hammered bronze, the air warm and still, the kind of day when the sea seems to have paused to listen, when some sailors rounding a headland came upon a young man standing alone on the shore. He was young, and his eyes were dark and full of something like distant laughter, and his chiton was fine, and they thought at once that he must be the son of some great house, worth more if carried elsewhere than left on a beach. So they brought him aboard their ship, and the ship moved out into the bright water, and the young man sat quietly at the prow and said very little, only watching the sea with those dark eyes that seemed to hold some private amusement. For a while the ship sailed on, and the sailors went about their ropes and their talk, and the heat of the afternoon lay over everything like a heavy cloth. The young man did not seem troubled or afraid or anxious in the least. He sat as easily in the bow of that stolen ship as a man sits beside his own hearth, perfectly at home in whatever place the world had put him. Then something began to happen slowly, the way things happen in old stories, not with a clap or a thunder, but with a creeping, warm, impossible green. A vine began to grow from the base of the mast, not quickly, not violently. It simply grew, the way a vine grows when one turns away and comes back an hour later and finds it has gone further up the wall than one remembered. Tendril by tendril, leaf by leaf, the dark green vine climbed the mast, and the sailors, who had been busy with their own affairs, noticed it one by one, going very still as they did, the way people go still when something beautiful and inexplicable is happening. The vine spread along the yardarm and down the rigging, and where it touched, it became festooned with dark clusters of grapes, heavy and fragrant even in the sea air, a smell that does not belong to the open water, the smell of crushed stone and warm earth, and something sweet fermenting in the dark of a cool stone cellar. And then, the story goes, wine began to run, not flooding, not violent, but flowing sweetly along the planks the way water flows along a tilted table. And the scent of it rose over the Aegean, and the air turned thick and golden. Ivy came after the vine, dark and glossy, wreathing the oars and the stern, and the whole ship was green and fragrant and strange. The young man at the prow was still sitting quietly, only now the vine wreathed his shoulders too, and his dark eyes were calm and full of that same distant warmth, and the sailors understood at last who they had tried to carry off, though the story does not linger on what they understood, only on the miracle of the growing vine, the sweet smell of the wine running in the salt air, the impossible green of it all against the flat, bright blue of the sea. That is the image the old Homeric hymn wishes to leave. Not fear, not judgment, but wonder. A ship become a garden, sailing on a summer sea, carrying the god of the vine home. For this was always the truest nature of his gift, not power, not dominion, but transformation of the quiet and welcome kind. The vine takes bare stone and thin soil and slow seasons and turns them into something that loosens the tongue and warms the chest and makes the evening feel less long. The Greeks, who were careful about such things, always mixed their wine with water, a generous pour of water, a measured pour of wine, for it was thought that only the very ill-mannered or the very unhappy drank it neat. In the mixing, the god was present in his most civilized form, not overwhelming, not obliterating, but softening, as the evening light softens the edges of limestone walls when the sun goes low. The wine-dark evening, Homer uses that very phrase, wine-dark, to describe the sea itself, and there is something true in it, something about the depth and the purple going into black of both, the way both hold things in them that cannot quite be seen from the surface. When the day's work was finished and the light began to turn, a Greek household would light the lamp, a small clay vessel with a wick floating in olive oil, giving off a warm, slightly oily smell that is among the most ancient of domestic perfumes, and bring out the bread and the olives and the figs, dark and soft with ripeness, and a bowl of wine already mixed, already waiting. The symposium, which means simply the drinking together, was not, in its best form, a riot of noise and excess. It was a circle of friends in a lamplit room, reclining on low couches, the wine bowl at the center, the talk going slow and thoughtful as evening talk does when no one is in a hurry to be anywhere. A poem might be spoken, passed around the circle, each man adding a line or a verse from memory, the way one passes a cup. A lyre might be played, nothing showy, only the kind of music that fills the silences between sentences and makes the silence more comfortable rather than less. In this way, the god was present not as a great force, but as a gentleness, the same gentleness that belongs to sleep and to the muse's song and to the river Lethe murmuring its soft forgetting over smooth pebbles in the cave of Hypnos. All these gifts are the same gift the poets knew, the gift of setting the day down, the loosening of the fist that has held the anxieties of the long hours, the accounts not balanced, the words said badly, the worry about the harvest, the tiredness behind the eyes, all of it, gently, like a garment slipped off at the door, left at the threshold while the soul sat quiet in the lamplit room and breathed. The old poets did not think it strange that the god of the vine and the god of sleep were kin in spirit, if not in blood, both offering the same mercy, the same brief respite from the weight of being conscious and worried and alive in the particular way that human beings are alive, which is to say, always slightly burdened, always carrying something. Dionysus did not promise to take the burden away forever. That was not his gift. Only for an evening. Only for the length of a cup and a song and a conversation going nowhere in particular, in a lamplit room, while outside the stars came out over the olive groves and the crickets settled into their long nocturnal singing. There is one more story that belongs to this god, and it is the gentlest of all his stories, gentler even than the vine growing up the mast. It is the story of a princess who slept on a shore and woke to find herself not alone. Her name was Ariadne, and she had been through much already, in the way that the figures in old stories often have been through much before the good part comes. The sad part the old tales tell passes quickly here, in one soft breath. She had been left, sleeping, on the island of Naxos, the white beach and the blue sea around her, and she slept on unknowing while the world rearranged itself into something better than it had been. When Ariadne woke, the light was the pale gold of early morning, and the sea had the quality that the sea has in that first hour. Very clear, very still, the color of the inside of a shell, everything on the shore distinct and particular in the clean new air. And Dionysus was there. The story does not elaborate much on how or why. It only says that the god came to the shore of Naxos in that early light, and that he saw her, and that what he felt was simply love. The uncomplicated, warm, unhurried kind that does not ask for explanations. He sat beside her on the pale sand, and the sea moved quietly at the edge of the world, and the morning went on around them. He loved her, the old poets say, and married her, in the way the gods mark their great affections, not with ceremony so much as with permanence, with the making of something that will last. And so, when it came time to give her a wedding gift, Dionysus did what gods do when they wish to honor what they love. He took her bridal crown, a circlet of gold set with jewels, the kind a princess might wear on the happiest day of her life, and he flung it upward into the night sky. It rose and rose, and where it came to rest, the stars caught in it and held, and there it remains to this day, the corona, the northern crown, a small and perfect wreath of stars. On clear nights over the Aegean, when there is no moon, and the air is dry and the sea lies flat, that small constellation is there among the others. Not the brightest, not the grandest, but quietly present. The way a kind thing done long ago remains present in the memory, warm and without edges. The Greeks would look up on summer evenings and see Ariadne's crown, and think of the girl who woke on a white shore into something better than what had come before, and the god who loved her, and the wine-dark sea around the island of Naxos, and the morning light on the water. It was a story about how sleep and sorrow can give way, on the other side, to something gentle. The gift of Dionysus, then, was always this: the waking that comes after the rest, the morning after the long dark, the easing that follows the holding tight. His theater, too, carried this same spirit. On the southern slope of the Acropolis in Athens, there was a great theater cut from the living rock, a bowl of stone open to the sky, with tiers of seats rising in a wide semicircle around a circular dancing floor. And beyond that, the stage, and beyond the stage, the blue distance of the city and the sea. The theater was his, and it was in his honor that the great plays were performed each year, in the festival that bore his name. Imagine the theater at dusk, when the plays of the great festival are about to begin. The audience has been coming in since the late afternoon, thousands of them, the whole city filling the stone bowl row by row, settling onto the tiered seats, the low murmur of many people finding their places and growing comfortable. The light is going blue now, that particular deep blue of the Attic evening that painters and poets have always tried to describe and never quite managed, the color that is not quite blue and not quite violet, and holds in it the warmth of the ended day, even as the coolness of the night begins to come in from the sea. And then the play begins, and it is as if the whole city is sharing a dream. This is what the theater is, at its truest, the communal dream, the story lived in common, 10,000 people breathing together in the open air, their attention gathered to a single point on the lit dancing floor below, while the stars come out one by one over the rim of the theater. The god is present here in his most civilized and lasting form, not in excess, but in the gift of the story itself, the gift of being taken out of one's own small life for an evening and carried into the life of Oedipus or Antigone or Hecuba, and returned at the end, changed in some quiet way, the heart enlarged. When the play was done and the night fully settled, the audience would come down from the stone seats slowly, the way people leave a place that has held them gently, and they are not quite ready to go back to the ordinary world. They would walk home through the darkened city, the Acropolis above them, pale in the moonlight or the starlight, the streets quiet, the oil lamps in the windows of houses making small warm passages of light in the dark. And they would carry something with them, not a thought exactly, not a lesson, only a quality of feeling, a kind of spaciousness in the chest, the way one feels after having wept at something beautiful, or laughed from the very center of oneself. This is the god's last and most durable gift. Not the wine itself, but what the wine makes possible. The conversation that goes somewhere true, the story that cracks something open in a quiet way, the evening that ends with a person feeling, without quite knowing why, that the world is larger and stranger and more full of grace than it seemed at the start of the day. The lamp burns low, the mixed wine is finished, the figs are eaten, the song is done. Outside, the olive trees hold still in the windless night, and the stars are very bright, and the cricket has found its note and holds it. And the day, that long and ordinary and difficult and irreplaceable day, is finally gently over. In the cave of Hypnos, there is always the smell of poppies and the sound of the Lethe moving over its stones, and now, drifting in among the formless dreams, there is something else. The faintest trace of wine and fig and lamp oil, and the blue going black of a theater sky at the moment when the first star appears. The dream of Dionysus settles among the others, unhurried, warm, taking its place in the long night the way a vine takes its place along a wall, slowly, without effort, finding the light that is available and resting there. The cave is quiet. The god of sleep breathes steadily on his couch of dark down, and outside, Nyx draws her star-strewn mantle a little closer around the sleeping world. Beyond the cave's dark threshold, where the poppies nod their heavy heads in no wind at all, there is a sound that has always been there, beneath every other sound. The river Lethe moving over pale stones, its voice a low and steady murmur, like a lullaby that has forgotten the words but not the rhythm. The water is dark and cool, smelling faintly of deep earth and wet clay. And the stones it passes over have been smoothed by its patience into shapes as gentle as sleeping palms. Nothing the river carries is sharp. Nothing it holds has any weight. It was said among the old Greeks that beside the god of sleep there lived his brother, not as a fearsome presence, but as the other half of a quiet kindness. The way a candle's warmth is one thing, and the shadow it casts is another, and both of them gentle. His name was Thanatos, and the poets who knew him best did not picture him with any coldness. They saw him as a winged youth, dark-haired and soft-voiced, resting beside his brother in the cave where the sun never came. The two of them so alike in face and form that even the old gods paused at the sight of them. The story of Thanatos was told most tenderly in one old tale, when the hero Sarpedon fell on a far battlefield, and Zeus, who loved him, could not bear to leave him there in the dust. And so he sent his two kindest servants, Sleep and Death, the brothers, winged and careful, to lift the fallen one and carry him home. It was said they bore him as gently as a mother lifts a sleeping child, his limbs easy, his face at peace, the long journey home to his own green country made without any difficulty or fear. Laid down softly in his own land. That was what Thanatos was, in the Greek imagining. Not a reaper, not a darkness to be feared, but the gentle one who walks close behind the tired and says, very quietly, that everything can be set down now. The pack that has grown heavy over many miles, the worry held since morning, the name of every obligation, each one released into the river's current and carried away so softly that the releasing feels like nothing more than an exhaled breath, a shoulder easing, a jaw unclenching in the moment before sleep finds the face and smooths it into something like the face one had as a child. Sleep and his brother, the two kindest powers at the edge of the world, resting together in the cave where even the light of Helios does not reach. Between them, in the deep quiet of that place, there is no conversation, because there is no need for any. They have sat beside each other since before memory began, since before the first morning made it possible to count the days. The poppies outside the cave door sway in a breath that comes from nowhere and goes nowhere. And the river speaks its single long word over and over, and the two winged brothers rest, and the night holds every sleeping thing. And within the cave, deeper than the brothers' dark couch, the dreams moved. The old poets called them the oniroi, the countless ones, each with a form as uncertain as smoke, some wearing the faces of the beloved, some wearing the shape of distant lands, some becoming the rumble of rivers or the texture of stone walls warm in afternoon sun. They drifted without sound through the cave's interior, each carrying a small and private story, the way seeds drift on still autumn air. Most of them would never be dreamed at all. They waited, patient as the dark itself, for a sleeping mind to open like a hand. Among them moved Morpheus, the most gifted of all the dreams, who could take the shape of any human face and speak in any human voice with such faithfulness that even grief-sharpened memory could not tell the difference. He had stood, in the old stories, at the bedsides of queens and shepherds alike, wearing the face of someone dearly missed, and spoken a word of comfort so exact and so gentle that the sleeper woke weeping and did not know entirely whether the visit had been dream or truth. By daylight it could never be decided. By daylight, perhaps, it did not need to be. The old poet spoke of two gates through which the dreams pass out into the sleeping world. One carved from polished horn, smooth and translucent as a thin moon, through which the true dreams come, and one carved from ivory, white and beautiful and opaque, through which the lovely false ones pass. Homer knew these gates, and Virgil after him, and the poets never quite agreed on which dreams came from which. But there was something gentle in the not knowing, because by morning it rarely mattered. A dream of reunion with someone gone had been warm, and warmth was what it left behind, and warmth was enough. We move now, as the night deepens, away from the cave and back into the world of warm rooms and banked fires, to Hestia, who held the still center of every Greek home. She was the first child of Kronos to be born, and so in the way of circular things, in some telling the last to be freed. And yet when the world settled into its order, she asked for nothing more than the hearth, the central fire, the altar that was also a kitchen, and a family's warmth gathered into one place. Every house had her. Every home's fire was hers. She was the oldest of the gods' domestic graces and the most quietly beloved. At night, the last thing a careful Greek household did before sleep was tend the hearth fire, not extinguish it, but bank it, drawing the coals together into a low, breathing mound and raking warm ash over them so that the heat was preserved, held close, waiting. The smell of it was particular, not the sharp smell of an active fire, but the slower, deeper smell of coal warmth and wood memory, the smell of a fire that is resting rather than working. In the morning, it would be coaxed back to life with a breath, and Hestia would be there again. The same fire that had never fully gone out, the same warmth that had waited all night like a faithful thing. And far to the west, where the sun goes at the end of its day, beyond the sea that the Greeks knew and beyond the sea they imagined, there was said to be a garden. It stood at the very edge of the world, always in the hour of late afternoon, always golden, always warm in the way that late light is warm, the light that falls sideways across the grass and makes ordinary things luminous. This was the garden of the Hesperides, the daughters of evening, 3 or 4 in number depending on the telling, and they tended it with a quiet care that needed no urgency, because nothing in that garden was ever in danger of dying. The daughters of evening moved among the trees of that garden the way shadows move in late light, slowly, without effort, changing the shape of things softly. They were said to sing, though the old stories never quite preserved the words of their singing, only the fact of it, the way one remembers that there was music at a particular evening long ago without being able to recall the melody. Their tree bore golden apples that never fell without being gathered, and the garden smelled of warm fruit and salt from the nearby sea, and something green and living that had no exact name, only the sensation of it, cool and sweet in the throat. The Hesperides garden was always at dusk. That was the particular mercy of it. The long golden hour that in the ordinary world must eventually turn to night had been given, in that western place, the quality of permanence. Not a frozen permanence, not a stillness that is emptiness, but the living permanence of a moment deeply inhabited, the way a good evening among people one loves seems, while it is happening, to be a thing that could go on. The daughters of evening did not wish for morning. They had no need of it. They had their singing and their trees and the warm light that never quite left. And yet even that garden, far and golden, would eventually settle into the drawing in that comes with the deepest part of the night. The light dims, degree by degree, the way the best evenings do. Not suddenly, but so gradually that one only notices it has gone when it is already gone, and the first stars are there where the amber had been. The daughters of evening would draw their himatians closer around their shoulders, and their singing would grow softer, and the golden apples would glow for a time in the dark like small remembered fires, and then the garden, too, would rest. Back along the edge of the world, back toward the cave, the river Lethe speaks. It has been speaking all this time, through the tales of gods and seasons, through the hearth's warmth and the garden's golden permanence. It's one long syllable, water over pale stones, the sound of a language that has no words for weight or worry. The river of forgetting is not a cruel thing. The Greeks who named it understood that some forgetting is the greatest kindness, that the sleep which comes without the day's events pressing in behind the eyes is a sleep of rare and genuine rest. To drink from Lethe was not to lose oneself, it was to set oneself down, to set down the name of every trouble, to set down the particular sharp-edged quality of the afternoon's frustration, the thing that was said that needn't have been, the long list of what remains undone. The river receives all of it without comment, without keeping score, without remembering on anyone's behalf. It simply carries everything away at its own unhurried pace, the way all rivers carry what is given them. Not quickly and not carelessly, but with the steady and reliable patience of water, which has been doing this work since before there were words to name the work. By morning, the stones are simply stones again, smooth and clean. Outside the cave, high and wide and cold with beauty, Nyx drew her star-strewn mantle across the last of the visible sky. She moved in the way of something so old it no longer needs to hurry, the way a tide moves, or a season, inexorable and entirely unhurried, covering the world in her dark cloth with its 10,000 small lights, each one a pinprick through which the older brightness beyond showed faintly, the way embers glow through ash. She was the mother of the dreams and of sleep, and of his gentle brother, and of things older still. She asked for no acknowledgement. She simply came as she always came, and covered everything. Across the sleeping world, the lamps were going out. In the houses of the city, where the oil had lasted through the evening's conversation and the children's settling, the flame was pinched or blown between two careful fingers, a brief last smell of warm oil and wick smoke, and then the dark. In the villages at the edges of the olive groves, the same small extinguishing repeated in 100 rooms, each one a quiet ascent to the night. The smell of those going-out lamps drifted on the still air, warm and particular, the smell of a day that is truly finished, of a body that is ready, of a mind beginning to release its grip. The hearth coals in every Greek home settled lower, the ash thickening over them, their glow a deep and patient ember red barely visible from across the room. The smell of banked wood smoke filled the sleeping houses, warm and low, rising perhaps to the ceiling beams where it gathered and dissolved into nothing. The dogs had found their places near the warmth of those same hearths, and lay with their sides rising and falling slowly, their dreams small and twitching. Brief images of the day's run across some field already half forgotten, Even the olive trees outside stood without moving, their leaves silver and still in the starlight, holding the night as leaves hold dew, lightly and without effort. And the cave received it all, not as a collector, not as a keeper of anything, but the way a deep and quiet room receives sound, letting it settle into the walls, into the floor, into the soft dark of its own patience. The poppies at the threshold nodded their heads on their long stems, and the river Lethe moved in its steady and unhurried way through the dark, and the formless dreams drifted without touching one another, each holding its small, unlit story. Hypnos breathed on his couch of dark down. His brother rested beside him. The night was very deep now. The world was ready. The long, kind giving over to sleep had already begun. Nyx settled the last fold of her mantle across the horizon, where no color remained. The Hesperides garden was dark now, the golden apples keeping their warmth only in memory. The river murmured its one patient word. The dreams drifted. Hypnos lay still, the god of sleep in the kingdom of sleep, his breath so slow and even it had become part of the silence rather than a disturbance in it. And somewhere, in the world above this cave, on a hillside that the next chunk of the night would find, a shepherd lay in the deep grass under the open sky, his flock around him, the dew beginning to settle on his hands, his face turned upward toward the stars. The stars were turning now, slowly, the way they always turn. The Bear circling its fixed northern point, Orion tilting toward the western horizon, the Pleiades almost gone below the edge of the world. All through the long night, the gods had rested in their dim domains. Poseidon still, the sea a dark breathing beneath him, Demeter in her grain-sweet hall, Hephaestus with his forge fires banked to amber coals. The world was settling. The world was done, for now, with its dreaming. And the dreams, those formless, gentle creatures, the Oneiroi, children of Hypnos and the night, were drifting home. Through the cave's two gates they came, one by one, and then in soft clusters, like leaves settling after a wind has passed through an olive grove. The true dreams through the gate of polished horn, the other kind through the gate of carved ivory, and all of them folding quietly down around the black couch where Hypnos lay, gathering like grains of sand brought in by a tide, covering the floor in their soft, wordless weight. We move now, one last time, back through the cave's cool mouth, where the night air smells of poppy and cold stone, and the far sea carried faintly on a current from the west. The river Lethe was sliding over its pale stones as it had always slid, no faster, no slower, murmuring its one low note of forgetting. The poppies at the cave mouth nodded in the faintest of breezes. No bird called, no branch moved. The silence was so complete it had become a kind of presence, warm and soft as a blanket drawn up to the chin. In the far west, Nyx was drawing the last of her star-strewn mantle across the final arc of sky, gathering her gentle children home as she always did before the pale suggestion of morning. Her mantle moved slowly, the way a tide moves, the way sleep moves through a body, unhurried, thorough, touching everything at last. Hypnos lay on his couch of dark down, and his breath was the breath of the cave itself, slow and even, indistinguishable now from the sound of the river, from the sound of the silence, from the sound of the night completing its old work. Out of the dream's last softening, one more story rises, the quietest of all, the one the poets kept for the end of things. There was a shepherd named Endymion who pastured his flocks on the slopes of Mount Latmos above the Aegean. He was young, and the poets agreed that he was very beautiful, though he was simply a shepherd with a shepherd's plain life. Grass under his feet in the morning, stars overhead at night, his flock around him, the sound of the sea somewhere below in the dark. One night, the story does not say which night, only that it was clear and still, Selene, the moon, looked down as she crossed the sky and saw him sleeping there on the hillside. And she loved him, the way moonlight loves still water, quietly, without asking anything in return. Night after night she came across the sky and looked at his sleeping face, and the longing she felt was a still and silver longing. Nothing urgent, nothing sharp. Only the wish that this moment might be kept, that he might go on sleeping there, peaceful, untroubled, unchanged. And so the gift that was granted to Endymion, the poets differ on how it was asked, and it does not matter, was not glory, not strength, not the loud things heroes are given. It was only this, that he might sleep forever, young and untroubled, never aging, never grieving, his rest unbroken and deep and sweet. And so he sleeps, the old stories say, on his hillside above the Aegean, his flock around him, the dew settling gently on his hands, his face turned upward without knowing it toward the light that watches over him. Every clear night, it is said, the moon comes down the long arc of the sky to look on his sleeping face. She asks nothing of him, not that he wake, not that he speak, not that he know her name, only that he sleep well, only that the grass beneath him be soft and the air be mild and the night be long. There is no story simpler than this one, and perhaps that is why the poets kept it for last, because at the end of all the great tales, what remains is this: someone sleeping peacefully, and someone who loves him watching over his rest. The night belongs to sleep now, and his cave keeps every story safe until morning. The great tales, the first light over the young world, the gods finding their domains, the seasons turning in their patient cycle, all of them rest here in the dark, folded among the dreams around the black couch, waiting quietly. The river Lethe slides over its stones. The poppies are still. Nyx has drawn her mantle to the last corner of the western sky. The moon keeps her watch on the hillside above the sea. It is enough now to rest. The river Lethe moved over its pale, smooth stones, thin and unhurried, as it had always moved, before the gods, before the stories, before any name was given to the dark. A faint mist rose from the surface and curled upward into the cave's cool air and dissolved there into nothing. No sound came from the world above, no bird, no wind, no footstep. Only the water, moving, and the dark around it, and the soft pull of forgetting, drawing everything toward rest. At the cave mouth, the red poppies stood still in the windless air, their petals soft and heavy, closing as the deep of night deepened further. Beyond them was only darkness, the good darkness, the old darkness, the kind that held no threat but only the slow, velvet promise of sleep. The stone around the entrance was cool and damp to the touch. The scent of the flowers drifted inward, sweet and drowsy, mingling with the smell of cold water and old stone. On the hillside of Mount Latmos, above the dark Aegean, Endymion lay in the deep grass under the open sky. His flock slept around him, warm and still. The dew had settled on his hands, on his face, on the long grass at his side. He did not stir. His breath rose and fell, slow and even, part of the night's own breathing. The moonlight lay across him like a silver cloth, gentle and unhurried, the way all good rest comes, without asking, without announcement, simply there. Selene was low now in the western sky, moving as the moon always moves, too slowly for any single watcher to see, and yet she moved, and the path of silver light on the Aegean moved with her, shortening toward the shore. The water was very dark and very still. A single star hung just above the horizon, bright enough to have a name once, though what name it carried into this particular quiet, no one was saying. The sea breathed below. The sky deepened. The moon was almost at the sea now, her light growing amber and long as light does at the edges of things. The last bright star pulsed once, faintly, and held. The sky in the east had not yet changed. It was still the deep, true black of the hours before any light, the hours that belong entirely to Hypnos and Nyx, and the river and the poppies and the silent settling dreams. The shepherd slept on his hillside. The world was very quiet. Somewhere in the world, in a small room that smelled of olive oil and cool plaster, a lamp had burned through the night. It had lit the telling of the stories, or perhaps only seemed to. the way a lamp in a dream seems to give light though no flame is really there. Now the oil was nearly gone. The flame leaned sideways once, very slowly as if bowing. Then it gathered itself back to a small, still point of warmth and held there and held. And so the lamp burns low on our journey through the myths of ancient Greece. Thank you for traveling with us tonight. Until our next journey, Lullaby Atlas. Sleep well.